Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm David Schenker, Director of the Program on Arab Politics here. This is actually a pretty big turnout for a meeting on Egypt these days. It's not much in the headlines compared to anything else, and there's not really seemingly a whole lot of interest in Washington, and yet Egypt remains a key partner of Washington in the region. We're here today for a policy forum about Egypt and Washington, marking the publication of Barak Barfi's new monograph, Egypt's New Realism Challenges Under Sisi, which is a very interesting piece of research. Barak Barfi is, of course, a research fellow at the New America Foundation and author of the recent Washington Institute study, as we saw. Michelle Dunn needs no introduction, but she is the director of the Middle East program at Carnegie and has served for quite a while in different positions in the U.S. government. I was thinking about Egypt, and I'll just say about one or two quick words. I was thinking about Egypt this week. I went to what's it called, Arabian Sights, or an Arab film festival in Bethesda, and saw a movie on Sunday night, Talaq Sinai, which is called Induced Labor. It's a Khalid Diab movie that came out recently. Spoiler alert here, I'm going to tell a little bit about the plot, but it's about an average Egyptian couple. A woman is pregnant and going to have twins, and the husband, due to the status of his life in Egypt, poverty, lack of opportunity, frustrations galore, decides that his wife should give birth in the U.S. Embassy, so that their children will be American citizens and will have some sort of opportunity in life. The movie really highlights not only the desperation of average Egyptians, but it's also quite, in many ways, subversive in its depiction of police brutality, incompetence of security services. It was really quite a poignant movie for a comedy, in the true sort of spirit of Egyptian comedies. Anyway, in that spirit, we have today Barak Barfi to talk about this new publication. There's a lot to talk about, And the monograph itself, I think, does a great job in covering broad aspects of what's going on in Egypt, ranging from these governance issues to foreign policy challenges to the economy. So I'm really looking forward to what Brock has to say, and then we'll hear from Michelle Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I want to talk about some things that were in my monograph and some things that weren't in my monograph that I didn't cover. First of all, when we looked at the corrective movement of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of 2013, a lot of people think, oh, it's a return to military rule, it's a return to the system that Jamal Abdel Nasser set up in 1952 and then 54. But the officer corps is much different now than it was then. And there's different elites right now. The National Democratic Party, the ruling party, the rural officials have not been able to reestablish their patronage networks to the same extent. There is even no ruling party at this time because Sisi knows about Sisi is well aware of the corruption issues that ensue when you do create a ruling party. However, Sisi's been taking tough decisions that his predecessor didn't take. Mubarak was very, very conservative. Among those are the economy. When we talk about the economy, there was a period of growth in the 2000s, but in the late 90s and the 2000s, but that growth was really illusory. It was basically fueled by domestic consumption and not by exports. So what happened is that Egypt had a balance of payment problems, shortages of foreign exchange. And how does Egypt historically cover those shortfalls? They rely on tourism and foreign direct investment. And those two streams of revenue dried up. And this third stream of revenue is foreign aid. Egypt is a very unique country in that it charges countries rent. It's not a rentier state like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries that rely on one commodity and then relieve their citizens of having to pay for taxes and whatnot and create a welfare state. In contrast, Egypt charges countries rent. Egypt positions itself as a very important country in the Middle East, and it's able to extract aid from these countries. Egypt was the number one recipient of American foreign aid until 1967 war. It was probably the largest recipient of foreign aid from the Soviet Union. I don't know the complete figures off the top of my head. After 67, specifically when Sadat came to power in 1970, the money shifted to the Gulf countries, and they funded Egypt's balance of payment problems for years. And then the Americans took over after the 73 war, and then after the Camp David agreements. So we have a new IMF program that came into being in 2016. And if we look at the IMF programs in history, Egypt has been on and off with the IMF program since the 70s. And actually the first IMF program, I think, was in 65. The first feelers to the IMF was in 65 under Nasser. None of these programs have worked. What they do basically is they shore up the balance of payments, they improve foreign exchange, but they don't lead to any type of real growth, and they deal with macro issues and not with micro issues. And the problem in Egypt is just as much micro as it is macro. So Egypt again is doing really well with the IMF program. Its foreign currency reserves were under $15 billion for, I think, several months in 2014, 2015, and that is under the 3 months of imports that the IMF recommends. But however, it has recovered, but most of that is because of the Gulf aid that has flown into its coffers. Various, not just aid, but there's deposits into the central bank that's been made by the Gulf countries. So these are the reasons that the economy is showing increases in productivity and growth. If you look at the underlying revenue streams that Egypt relied on, specifically tourism, after the November 2015 crash of the Russian jet, I think the numbers were around 900,000. They fell in half for the next few months, and they have not come back to those levels. So you're not seeing the same type of revenue generation as you did in the past. It's all based on foreign aid. One of the issues that's important here that we talk about a lot in Washington and the West is the human rights component. There's specifically the crackdown of the Sisi government on all type of dissent, opposition. I think last week they arrested a man who wrote a book. He's written 10 books, but this book upset the government because it talks about the subsidy programs and how they don't work. But if you look at United States' relationship, views on human rights, it's always colored by the relationships with the countries. I'll give you just one example. Hussein Habri was invited, Chadian leader was invited to the United States by Ronald Reagan, I think in November 1987. And Reagan said at that time, and I quote, "Chad's accomplishment is admired by the free world. The friendship between Chad and the United States reflects our shared commitment to freedom and international cooperation," unquote. This man was recently convicted of ordering the killings of 40,000 people. Why did Reagan host him in Washington and say such nice things? Because he was fighting Muammar al-Gaddafi at the time, and Gaddafi was public enemy number one in Washington, otherwise known as the Mad Dog of the Middle East. The United States has only demonstrated a commitment to human rights when it serves its interests, and there's no reasons to do so in Egypt. One of the big issues is the NGO law that the government passed. This didn't really come from the president himself. There was a lot of pressure in Parliament for it. And on the streets, if you talk to Egyptians, they think that these NGOs are undermining the state. And it's part of the large wave of xenophobia that has overtaken the Egyptians since 2011. Egypt was one of the most open Arab countries and one of the most welcoming of foreigners. I spent a lot of time in countries such as Syria and Yemen, and nobody ever welcomed me as much as they did in Egypt. So the whole idea that not only on this side of the Atlantic, but on that side of the Atlantic, that human rights are important is not something that really resonates over there. There are much more important priorities in the country. One of the priorities of the government is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that the Ethiopians are building. Excuse me. Egypt, this dam is going to significantly reduce Egypt's Nile water while the dam is being filled, a 70 billion cubic meter reservoir. Egypt bases its rights to the Nile water on colonial treaties that none of the other Nile basin states signed. Specifically, it bases it on a 1959 treaty that it signed with Sudan, splitting up the Nile's water, giving Egypt 55 billion cubic meters and Sudan 18.5 billion cubic meters. But this is only part of the story. None of the statistics that the Egyptian government documents or publications publish are correct on the dam. The UNDP and the Nile Basin Initiative cite much higher Nile extraction rates for the Egyptians, and even the Sudanese don't use their whole 18.5 BCM allotment. It's more like 12. And Egypt is failing at diplomacy, so the two states that would be affected by the dam are Sudan and Egypt. Both are Arab countries, sister states in the Arab League. Yet the Sudanese supported, I think in 2012, July 2012 was the first time that the Sudanese declared that they would support the dam, the building of the dam, because they accrue some benefits such as a second crop season and lower flooding rates from the dam. So Egypt is really doing a bad job at diplomacy. It is not making much headway with the Ethiopians. Sisi is chosen diplomacy over bellicosity, but it's not won him any concessions at the negotiating table. And the problem for the Egyptians is they're not preparing their population for the fall in the Nile water, specifically in November 2017. Sisi said, quote, "No one can touch Egypt's waters," unquote, when he knows that Egypt's waters are going to be touched, and they're going to be touched for several billion cubic meters per year. So on the opposition front, there really is no opposition right now. The leftist parties really don't have a lot of traction, a lot of support. You see people like Khalid Ali being arrested. It does not generate waves in Egypt. The only violent opposition is Islamism. It's the only ideological alternative to Nasserism, Arabism, and Egyptianism. The Muslim Brotherhood is down, but it's not out. It's never been destroyed. Nasser couldn't destroy it. Gaddafi couldn't destroy it. Assad couldn't destroy it. They always resurrect itself. Why? It offers. It's often a state within a state offering welfare services. One scholar in 2001 said there were about 1,500 to 2,000 clinics in Egypt. Brotherhood officials said that for about 5,000 non-governmental agencies, 20% belong to the Brotherhood. And the Sisi government concurs it's closed about 1,100 Islamist organizations. It's a mistake to see the Brotherhood as an organization of the poor. It's a middle-class organization. Its leaders are all professionals. It used to win all the syndicate elections. And how is it going to regenerate itself? It's going to build a new generation on campuses just like it did in the 70s. Why is it so successful? Its secrecy, exploits public spaces, and decentralized during crackdowns. One of the problems that the Brotherhood will have is fundraising. It's traditionally fundraised in the Gulf, which the Gulf countries always gave it shelter and protection from Gaddafi, from Nasser, from Assad. And they no longer do that. So fundraising is going to be difficult. When we look at Sisi, of all his predecessors, he most looks like Nasser. His reliance on the military, not just economics, but everywhere in the government. Nasser created a real neo-Mamluk state. All his top advisors were from the military. The ministers were from the military. The governors were from the military. And this is what we're seeing with Sisi. Other than the cabinet, the number of military officials with a military background in the cabinet is actually a little bit lower than it was under Mubarak. Also, he relies on massive infrastructure projects. This was a way to generate national feeling that Nasser used, and Sisi is using it as well. But he's also a Sadatist Egypt first. His refusal to get involved in the war in Yemen and his relationship with the Gulf Cooperation GCC countries. So while he does most mimic Nasser, he does draw a little bit on Sadat. So with the economy in the doldrums, one thing that's very surprising is the defense spending. So in America, we hear, we don't want to cut aid because the defense contractors would suffer. However, Egypt buys a lot of legacy weapons from non-American defense contractors. Just a few examples. Since 2005, it purchased Rafale jets and Gawain corvettes from France, MiG-29Ms from Russia, infantry fighting vehicles from Greece, and air defense systems from Germany. This is a problem considering that Egypt really does not have a lot of foreign currency. Moving forward, I mean, it has to, the government, specifically the president, has to placate the military, specifically, especially now that all the people around Sisi come from the military and especially military intelligence. But it's a problem down the road, and it's something that the Americans should talk to the Egyptians about. Specifically, what they need to do is they need to shift defense spending from legacy systems to human development in areas such as counterterrorism. Other policy recommendations that Washington can undertake is helping Egypt on the dam by facilitating an aid package of water-intensive crops. My paper lists the most water-intensive crops that Egypt has, that Egypt produces, staples such as rice. However, not staples such as wheat, because Egypt is a massive subsidizer of wheat, and it's just a waste of spending. Washington should also increase economic support and development funds. In 2008 budget, the administration only asked for $75 million for Egypt for this fund. It's the lowest ever. And the USAID has to improve coordination with the IMF and World Bank, specifically now that these two organizations are providing Egypt with so much money. We need to coordinate our aid with their projects and what Egypt needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Barak, and thank you, David, for inviting me to comment. So, Barak, thanks for your paper. I'm always happy to see people working on Egypt, and I think you go into a lot of nice detail on the economic subject and also the water subject, which I think that people are not paying enough attention to. So I'm really glad you delved into that. But my role here is to add some value. So I'm going to add some other issues that I think are major challenges for Egypt under Sisi, some of which are not mentioned as much in your paper. So, and I'll just to put them into three categories. One would be economic or socioeconomic issues, political issues, and then relations with the U.S. On the socioeconomic front, which is probably the most important one, I want to raise population growth as, I think, a very big issue for Egypt. There was slow progress in reducing population growth in Egypt from the 1970s until about 10 years ago. It started to reverse. And what happened is that now, at this point, the fertility rate in Egypt is back up to about 3.5 children per woman on average, which is kind of what it was decades back. Unfortunately, it had been cut to almost half that, and then it turned around in the last 10 years. Now, we could talk about what the reasons for this are. They seem to be related to the Egyptian government and maybe USAID and other donors as well, kind of devoting less attention to that issue compared to other issues. But at any rate, Egypt now has a population over 96 million in the country, another 10 million or so in the diaspora, and is projected to reach 128 million by 2030. So it's a massive issue, I think for Egypt, and it needs to be taken into account. I'll mention it as we come up to other things, but it's related to the water issue. I quite agree with you that the Renaissance Dam controversy with Ethiopia is an important one, and it's been one that Egypt has been sort of struggling to address through diplomacy over the last almost 10 years, during which Egypt, of course, has been undergoing a lot of political turmoil, and it's been very difficult for Egypt to do this. I might be a little bit more optimistic recently because of the change in leadership in Ethiopia, as well as the fact Ethiopia has run into so many problems of its own in completing the dam that the timetable has slowed down. And I agree with you that I hope that something will be worked out peacefully where the dam basin will be filled slowly enough that it won't cause a major and sudden drop in Nile water for Egypt. But the thing is, Egypt would have had a water crisis even if the Renaissance Dam would never have been built because of the population growth. It was already headed for a problem. And the other problem, as we know, is water usage. You talk about crop choice, which is an important one, and Egypt is trying to get on top of that. But another one really is irrigation methods. Egypt still does a lot of flood irrigation, which was very, very inefficient. So there's a lot of waste of water. And I think the focus really needs to be kept on agriculture here. Yes, one can have desalination plants, but the water, as I understand it, for residential and commercial usage is like 15% of Egypt's fresh water. It's something like 85% being used in agriculture. So that's where the crying need is. So both of these things, I think, the rapid population growth and the fact that water resources are poorly used and maybe diminishing are serious issues and serious threats to social stability. They're being addressed somewhat by the Egyptian government, but not, I think, with the kind of seriousness and focus that they should be, because the attention is elsewhere. Now, you mentioned the mega projects, whether it was the Suez Canal passage or now the new administrative capital being built in the desert east of Cairo. I think these kind of projects, which are meant as sort of monuments or to show that Egypt's doing something big and new and exciting and to drive growth. But the question is, do they really drive growth? And most people you will talk to are skeptical about this, and are skeptical about kind of where resources are being placed. On the economy more generally, you talk about the need to generate exports as a way to drive growth, and that's probably right. And I don't have the answers. I mean, Egypt is, as you note, I think in the paper, Egypt has an enormous labor force that needs to be employed. Where exactly they should be employed in this changing world, services, manufacturing, I don't have the answers there. I think that's a rapidly changing picture. But one of the things that is depressing growth, and even the IMF has started saying this quite openly, is the not only the extensive reach of the military into the economy, but the growth of that since 2015, and especially in the last few years. So that is, it's not generating the space for private sector-led growth that really should be there, and that could really employ large numbers of people. You mentioned in the paper that the Egyptian government is trying to, really push tourism and foreign direct investment. I would maybe say that it's more like tourism and energy. Both of which are promising sectors for Egypt, right? Tourism in Egypt always comes back. Egypt has resources for tourism that no other country in the world has. So, if security conditions permit, tourism, and it already is regenerating, will regenerate. And energy, of course, I would say that, could be mentioned more in the paper as a promising sector. The problem is, energy is not a major employer. Tourism can be a big employer. Energy, not so much. In terms of FDI, there's lip service given to it, but frankly, I don't think the Egyptian government is doing the things that it would really need to do to attract FDI, and it's partly because that would rub up against vested interests in the country and in the economy, and especially those of the military and the military-dominated countries. Okay, let me say something about political issues. Look, I think while your paper does mention, a lot of things that are going on, curbs on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so forth, I do think that the political repression and human rights picture are a lot darker than the paper necessarily suggests. I mean, that just wasn't where you chose to put your attention, Barak, and maybe you don't think it's a big issue, but I think it is, it's a much worse situation of political repression and human rights abuses than it was under Mubarak or Sadat, and arguably worse than it was under Abdel Nasser as well. So, I just have to mention, we're looking at tens of thousands of political prisoners, rampant torture, extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and so forth. What this does to the entire climate in the country, and by the way, the victims of almost all of these are young people, right? And a lot of them are young people who were active in 2011 or afterwards. It says, really change the climate. You do mention in the paper the media picture, the whole independently owned media that had slowly grown up in Egypt from about 2003 onwards are now, over. We were seeing basically companies apparently owned by parts of Egyptian intelligence buying up and now dominating the media alongside the government-dominated media. So you have this very I think, dark rights picture and a situation in the country in which it's very difficult for people to express themselves. You say, Barak, in the paper that the honeymoon phase of Sisi's rule has not ended. I don't know. I don't know how would one know that. I don't think that what we can see anecdotally, I think, suggests the honeymoon phase has ended several years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that Sisi would be overthrown soon or something like that. I mean, but at any rate, I don't think he's in a honeymoon phase. I think he's had to work pretty hard and use a level of brutality unseen before in Egypt to rebuild that wall of fear between citizens in the state, and that he has to keep working at that wall all the time to keep it quite high. Therefore, I just don't know when you say human rights are not a priority for Egyptians. I mean, based on what do you say that? I mean, we really don't know what Egyptians think about a lot of things. There's not good polling going on, except a little bit by David Pollock. Where is he? There's very little polling going on that's at all reliable. The free media is closed down. There's even little social science academic research that is able to go on. So the information we have coming out about what Egyptians think or whatever, I think is there's not much there. Another big political issue that you mentioned it just briefly at the end is Sisi's political mandate. So there are lots of signs now that there will be plans to amend the Constitution to lift term limits so that he doesn't have to leave office in 2022. He used to promise that he was going to leave at the end of his second term, not so much lately. And we certainly have seen his supporters, putting that forward. So I think, maybe Egyptians will support that. I mean, you mentioned in the paper one of your recommendations is that the U.S. should quietly impress upon Sisi the need to step down in 2022. But maybe we can talk during the discussion about what the U.S. should do when he doesn't accept that, because I don't think he's going to accept that. Every sign is he's going to try to stay there. Okay, so just a little bit more on relations with the U.S. One of the factors that I really think is important that isn't discussed much in the paper is the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress plays a major role in these bilateral relationships, especially when there's an aid relationship, because, of course, they control the purse strings. And so while President Sisi still has some fans in the Congress, I would say the long-term trend has been increasing skepticism in the Congress about Sisi and even about this bilateral relationship. I mean, if you look at the long-term trend, and sorry to be crass, but expressed in dollars and cents, the trend is down. Okay, almost all of the economic aid has been eliminated, and the military aid is still there, but we've seen, a couple of episodes in which chunks have been withheld. We see Congress placing conditions. We see a lot of, tugging back and forth between administrations, not just the Trump administration, but the Obama administration as well, and Congress over the conditions and so forth. So what we see is more questioning in Congress. And I would say this long-term trend is more significant than what one Secretary of State or another says. You know what I'm saying? It says something profound about, this relationship not being on as firm a footing as it once was. Now, you call for increasing economic aid, in some ways, I agree with you. I mean, I would probably rather see a shifting of some of the aid rather than an increase. I think it's very unlikely that Congress would increase the overall amount of aid to Egypt at this point back to maybe what it once was. I do think there are major issues like the water usage issue, maybe the population issue. I don't know. There are some really big issues. The human development and education issue. There's some really big issues with which Egypt could use international help. They're getting some, but could use more help from the World Bank and from major donors like the EU and like the United States. And I would think it would be a good thing for donors to work together on things like that. I'm a little bit more skeptical, though, about giving, I think you mentioned giving specific aid to motivate economic reforms or something like that. That U.S. has engaged in this type of thing before, and again, there have been a lot of unhappy experiences with this, and it's just it's been very, very difficult. And you might be aware that the Obama administration actually canceled more than $100 million in economic aid for Egypt when for some educational programs, even though there had been agreement between the U.S. government and the Egyptian ministries, and the Egyptian ministries were enthusiastic about these programs. Security agencies stepped in and basically made it impossible for them to be carried out. These were, I believe, some university partnerships. So there have been a lot of problems, and so there have been a lot of reasons why economic aid programs with Egypt have eventually kind of disappeared. And it's too bad, because Egypt could use the help. But reaching agreement and then implementing things, and this comes back to the NGO law. I mean, the U.S. government hasn't just objected to the new NGO law because of principle. It's because of the way it would operate. It would actually make it almost impossible for the U.S. to give the kind of economic aid that we normally do. And I'm not talking about aid to Egyptian NGOs. I'm talking about aid programs with parts of the Egyptian government that are normally carried out through American and or Egyptian or NGOs. So anyway, you also mentioned quietly pressing Cairo to switch military spending from heavy weapons to other things like counterterrorism. Agree with you, but the U.S. has been at this for a long time. Certainly, the current administration, the entire years of the Obama administration, and I think going back to the Bush administration, this is something. It's a long-term thing. Briefly, I would say at the very end of the paper, you have a section where you describe how little influence the U.S. has over Egypt's behavior in the region, how successive Egyptian governments have tended to buck U.S. plans and priorities and everything for the region. But and that's true, of course. Egypt's a sovereign country, and it's going to make its own decisions. I don't think it's, one wouldn't expect that the United States can dictate to Egypt what its policies in the region should be or whatever. But I think, unfortunately, some of those very arguments are being used by people, including in the Congress, who are starting to say, what real use is this alliance to us? because we don't cooperate very well. So, this is the problem, that I think it's over time, and particularly since 2013, it's become increasingly difficult for the U.S. government and the Egyptian government to say that we've got a common vision, or even if we do have a common vision, for example, on fighting terrorism, on fighting groups affiliated to ISIS. Another thing that isn't mentioned very much in the paper, which is a major problem for Egypt, is domestic terrorism. How to do it. There's sometimes the U.S. and Egypt have a hard time agreeing on goals. Sometimes when we can agree on goals, what are the best methods? What's productive? What's counterproductive in doing something like fighting terrorism is something we have a really hard time agreeing on.
Thank you so much, Michelle. There's a lot there to chew on. Before we get to a discussion, I'm going to give Barack a chance to address some of these comments. In particular, we get panels that we like to have a little bit of creative tension. So getting at that, you could start off with this question of, in the monograph, you make a very clear argument that, democracy, human rights, et cetera, appear to be a lower priority for Egyptians. And Michelle says, how do we know what Egyptians think? If you could start with that, and then you can talk about some of the other issues.
Well, first, thank you very much for your comments, Michelle. I wish you would have read the paper before and given those to me so I could have incorporated them. You made several excellent points. How do we know what Egyptians think? So I can say I went to Egypt. I went during the elections, and I traveled all over Lower Egypt, which is the north part of Egypt. I was able to go to polling stations and talk to many people. And what did I learn? It's very hard because of the atmosphere of xenophobia and fear of the government, that people will speak to you openly. So when you want to find out, you're going to really be limited to the people that you've known for 10, 15 years to know what's going on. But when I did have opportunities to go to talk to people in certain places, such as when I needed to do archival research in newspapers, I was able to speak with some people, and they were able to give me some insights. And what I was able to glean from those conversations was that Sisi still is in the honeymoon phase of his period. Why? Because of the whole idea of the Arab social contract. Giving up freedom for security is very, very important to Arabs. I've been in post-conflict countries ranging from Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Libya, and I hear the same thing from everybody. They want the security back that they had before the revolution, and they don't care to give up all their freedoms they had, because they don't want to walk in the street with their kids and have snipers shooting at them and bombs going off. So I do think that he's still in the honeymoon phase of his period, because the brotherhood issue is still very important. We still have the ISIS affiliate in Sinai. We still see what's going on from the Arab Spring. It's still fresh in people's minds. So they're willing to give Sisi so much space and tolerance. It's not just on the political front. This is the whole idea of the economic reforms that he's imposed. If you would have asked me 7 years ago if this could have happened, I would say it's impossible. You can't get rid of these subsidies in Egypt. This is what people rely on. But they're so tolerant and patient, the Egyptians, to give this up, because they think that there's going to be a better tomorrow. They think that he can rebuild the country. They think that he can reinstill this Egyptianism and this divine faith that the Egyptians have. About population growth. Yes, it's important. Do I talk about population growth in the paper? Not specifically, but I said that according to the IMF, the economy has to create 700,000 jobs per year. So that it requires a 4.5 increase in the GDP. So I went back to the Mubarak years, and I found out that the economic growth averaged 4.3%, which is less than 4.5, which is what the IMF says that is the historical growth rate of Egypt. So No, I didn't talk about the problems of population growth, but I spoke about their effects. And this is a problem. They can't generate these jobs. On Congress, yeah, we have senators like Patrick Leahy always trying to impose some type of strictures on the aid. But until there's some type of tectonic shift event, like what happened with Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey, you're not going to see that. Specifically, we said that amendment that Mike Lee sponsored, that to halt support for the Saudis in Yemen, it didn't pass 55 to it was defeated 55 to 44. So yes, there are people in Congress who want this, but when they voice their protest to this, you always have someone from the administration coming and say, no, this is very important. This is a national security interest, and Egypt will always be a national security interest because of its position in the Arab world, where it's geographically, its stability. Even now, it's destabilized in the Sinai, some political problems, but it's still strong. It's the only nation state in the Arab world. It's the only Arab state that has real institutions like a military. There is no military in Libya. There was no military in Syria. There was a sect that led Syria. And that's the reason these countries collapsed. Egypt is not going to collapse. Egypt is a pillar of strength, regardless of the political oppression that's going on. And yes, it's very, very bad. I agree with you. But it's just, we're not going to pull out from our support of Egypt.
Michelle, you want to go back at him one more time?
Well, look, I wasn't trying to say that I thought the United States would pull out of the relationship with Egypt. What I'm trying to say here is that you're quite right about the importance of Egypt. Right? The problem, the dilemma that the United States faces, now, and has faced on and off for a long time with Egypt, is this country is important. We want to be partners. We want to be friends. And yet, we see the government doing a lot of things that we think are counterproductive and are actually diminishing its ability to deal with its own problems. I mean, so whether it's political repression, whether it's political repression and human rights abuses that may be feeding the problem of radicalization and therefore feeding the problem of terrorism over time, whether it's too much of a military hand on the economy that that depresses growth, private sector growth, employment, things, these are the kinds of issues. So that's the problem that the United States faces. And it doesn't mean that the United States will walk away from this relationship, but it has a corrosive effect over time on the relationship.
Thanks. We'll get at questions in 1 second. I just wanted to ask both of you one question. We didn't talk about the North Korea stuff. This too complicates Washington's relationship with Cairo. Do you see any movement on this? Do you see any signs that we're coming to an understanding in this regard? We can throw Russia in there as well about the reports of Egypt trucking with Russia now too.
I think it's not so difficult for the Egyptians to cut off ties with North Korea. They don't really supply a lot, and I talk about a little bit about this in the paper and in what the UN reports found. The problem is the relationship is so long term, and the North Koreans have done a lot for the Egyptians, but I do think that it's something that they can cut ties with not so difficultly, as opposed to the Russians, which the Egyptians will cooperate with them, and American pressures may lead to some minor concessions, but not something major. They buy weapons from the Russians. The retrenchment of Russian influence in the region, it's focused a lot on Egypt. So the Russians can come in with all kinds of enticements and incentives when the Egyptians need them, and when the Americans aren't going to supply what they need. Specifically, there's some weapons. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's some weapons platforms that are incorporated, I think, in French weapons exports that the United States won't permit Egypt to get. Things like this, nuances.
Yeah, so, I agree with you, Barak, on the long-term nature of Egypt's relationship with North Korea is, it just, it always seems to come back. I mean, I don't know what's going on recently. I mean, there have been some signs of Egypt sort of, pulling back a little bit from the relationship with North Korea after the Trump administration, made its concerns pretty open about that. And there have been episodes like that before. But, with the kind of inducements that the North Koreans can offer and so forth for, either they can supply spare parts and things for older weapon systems, and also I don't know what the incentives are that North Korea has given to Egypt and other countries that have helped it to circumvent sanctions. I mean, what are the nature of those things? I don't know. What I can say is Egypt just seems to have a really hard time quitting North Korea. And I don't know, it always seems that relationship ebbs and flows. Hopefully now it's ebbing. But, history would suggest, as Barak said, this relationship goes back, way back, and decades. So in terms of Russia, I think it definitely has been a growth relationship. I mean, we've seen Sisi reaching out to a lot of other defense suppliers. You mentioned Germany and France and so forth as well, and trying to diversify his defense relationships. And certainly Putin is in a mood to do more in this region, and Egypt is a focus. So I think that's going to go on. And by the way, I think that's going to go on whether or not the United States puts conditions on aid or has withheld some aid or whatever, because it's not, one thing doesn't replace the other. Russia, at least at this point, doesn't offer Egypt an assistance relationship, right? Egypt buys things from Russia at this point. It's more of a commercial relationship.
Nuclear plant.
And when that's based on a loan, the nuclear plant would be based on a very large loan that Egypt would take from Russia. So, but it's not a grant relationship the way they have, with the United States. So it's not a direct replacement, and there are constraints on it. We saw Russia come forward publicly with a memorandum of understanding that they wanted Egypt to sign for reciprocal access to each other's air bases, which it seems like Egypt didn't sign. And we have seen, Egypt wants very much the return of all Russian commercial flights and Russian tourists to Egypt. They have returned to Cairo, but not so far to Sharm or Hurghada. Maybe they will. But what I want to say is that I think there's push and pull in this relationship too. Right? I mean, they're coming up from a low base. Over many years, there wasn't that much of an Egyptian-Russian relationship, and it's coming back. But it shouldn't be blown, out of proportion to what it is.
Thanks. All right, we have a number of people that want to ask questions. Mona, please.
Yeah. Thank you, David. I just have a few points here to make, which is, Michelle, you said you don't see any point in this alliance going on between Egypt and the U.S. I think the alliance is just as important for the U.S. as it is for Egypt. Egypt's main objective today is security and stability. The stability of Egypt means the stability of the whole region. It is not only Egypt. That is why economic aid is particularly important. Now you have alternatives to economic aid, particularly if you spoke about population growth, and this is education, and particularly education of girls, education of women. This is the number one objective where the United States can really make a contribution. This is one thing. The other thing is, when you said about I think the gentleman said that in 2020, the U.S. should put pressure on President Sisi to step down. I think I'm very extremely offended by this remark, and I don't see what is the point of asking the U.S. to ask President Sisi to step down. First of all, this is an intervention that is completely refused. That is one. And the second thing is, I don't see why it has to do with the United States. If the people of Egypt want to re-elect their president, they will, as they did for the second time this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Brock.
Yeah, very good point on education of women. So, if you read IMF reports, and I was lucky to read everything that the IMF has written on Egypt in the last 7 years, one of the things that they want to do is decrease unemployment. That is one of the priorities. The only step that was in these reports, that Egypt was going to take, was going to give 250 million Egyptian pounds to build nurseries so that women could come to work. But that's not going to create incentives for women to go to work and decrease female unemployment. Why? Women prefer hard-to-get public sector jobs. And the employers don't want to hire them because of the generous maternity benefits that they get. So it's not lack of skills, it's not education, it's that they want these public sector jobs. And now, so Nasser instituted a law, I don't know if it was a law, but in the 50s, that if you had a college degree, you could get a job in the government. What happened was that the bureaucracy bloated and they couldn't absorb all these people. You can still get a job with the government if you have a college degree. However, it's going to take you up to maybe 5 to 7 years to do so. So this is the problem This is the problem with female education.
Just to mention briefly on that issue, it's very tied to the population growth issue, because the rate of unemployment for young women is double the rate of unemployment for young men. And this is one of the issues that's been noted, that leads to women perhaps marrying earlier, starting families earlier, and any demographer will tell you that the earlier a woman starts having children, the more children she's likely to have over her lifetime. So I do think that the women's employment issue is related to the population growth issue.
David?
If I may, I have two short questions. One is about one thing that the polling data that do exist and that I think are credible demonstrate pretty clearly that neither of you mentioned is a lot of popular anti-Americanism in Egypt. And I wanted to ask whether you think that this is an important issue, whether there's anything that could or should be done about it, or whether it's just part of the sort of regional background noise that we have to accept and maybe even ignore. That's one. The second one is about political repression. And my question, I struggle to understand why authoritarian governments, friendly ones, that are genuinely and I think legitimately fearful of the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, why they also feel the need to repress even mild liberal critics or genuine Democrats of kind of, nonviolent, secular, constructive variety. And I think Michelle, you seem to suggest that this indicates how fearful they really are deep down of their lack of popularity or legitimacy, so that they have to recreate, as you put it, the wall of fear, even when maybe to an unnecessary or extreme extent. But I wanted to get a deeper understanding of why, because it's so frustrating when when we say, well, okay, some repression, yeah, but do you really have to, like, throw even reporters in jail and charity workers and you know, just sort of random, almost independent voices? And how do you explain that? And is there some way to help convince a government like Sisi's, perhaps, that he doesn't really have to do that in order to stay in power, and it would be better if he just kind of lightened up a little bit?
Okay, so I didn't talk about anti-Americanism, but I did speak about xenophobism on two occasions. The situation is very, very bad right now vis-a-vis anti-Americanism. And I'll just give you one example. You talk to many Egyptians on the street, and you say Hillary Clinton, they'll say, "Oh yeah, she wrote in her memoirs that the United States was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood to take power and whatnot." This passage doesn't exist in her memoirs. The United States is demonized in not only the government press, but the private press, and you had spoken about it as well. The private press becoming just another arm of the government. So they're just indoctrinated that we're playing a role in trying to subvert them and undermine them, and we supported the Brotherhood and we supported all the Arab Spring movements, and that leads to a lack of stability. About authoritarianism, 2 points. Authoritarianism and cracking and non-tolerance of dissent, on one level, harkens back to nationalism and the importance of being part of the community in the country. And when you're not working together, when you're not working against the government and you're going upstream, you are not working on a level of mass mobilization. And if you look at someone like Gaddafi, his whole life, all he wanted was to mobilize his population so that they would support his policy, so that they could become a great power on the Arab scene. The same with, if you read like Moshe Maoz's biography of Assad, you'll get the same stuff. So, and Sisi, in all his speeches, he talks about how great Egypt is and Egypt's mission in the Arab world. You can't realize this mission if people are working against you. So that is on one level, the nationalism aspect. Secondly, if you open the dam, it's going to burst. And this is what they fear. You can't give them any type of opening. Look at Syria with the Damascus Spring, what happened there. Look at people like Riyad Saif, who is a democratic reformer. He was in parliament. He was brought in. He was a businessman. He comes into parliament. He starts talking about the cellular contract that was awarded to Orascom, and I can't remember the Syrian affiliate, but it turns out it was Rami Makhlouf. And Rami Makhlouf pushed out Orascom, the Egyptians. He's causing problems, and he makes all kinds of petitions. These things, they get out of control, and they are so scared of those things, these authoritarian states.
Michelle?
Yeah, look, I basically agree with everything Barak has said here. One question I've been asked many times about anti-Americanism in Egypt is, how can it be that the United States has given Egypt, more than $70 billion of assistance over 40 years, and Egyptians hate us? And I say, but don't you get it? That's why they hate us. In other words, there is this, sense that the U.S. is or has tried to be the new regional hegemon, and for Egypt, after replacing the hated British, and so forth. So there's a certain nationalist, side to it, I think, that would always lead to some resentment of the foreign patron, and I think, by the way, we have seen at certain times, and we'll see in the future, some of that being directed, for example, against various players in the Gulf, right, who are foreign patrons, right, that Egyptians, as Barak said, unfortunately, the state has long been and continues to be dependent on infusions of external capital, right, and Egyptians resent the fact, and it violates their pride that this is the case. So that's there. But then it is quite true, especially since 2013, that this conspiracy theory, was put out about the United States trying to undermine Egypt and bring it under brotherhood rule. And it's total nonsense, but it's been put out night and day. You asked what can be done about it. I've always thought that American officials do too little in terms of engaging directly, in terms of they've been very reluctant at times when they've been accused of things that, frankly, to us sound crazy like this. To engage, to take these things on directly and speak about them, and to speak to the Egyptian audience in international media in which, Egyptians consume international, satellite television and so forth. So sometimes I think American officials, the American government doesn't quite get that right. Just briefly on political repression, yes, I do think it is what Barak was saying, because, while a movement like the Muslim Brotherhood might be the opposition, the only opposition movement in Egypt that had a significant popular base, and therefore would be, the most feared opposition movement. But these others, and there have been some arrested recently, right? Bloggers, people like Wael Abbas, or, people who can and do kind of persistently shed light on things like corruption, on things like economic injustice, vested interests, things like that. The way that various institutions in Egypt, like the judiciary and so forth, have been politicized, these are viewed as very dangerous. And I have heard. I think President Sisi has said a number of times that what happened in 2011 will not be allowed to happen again. And from what I have heard, he views the sort of gradual political opening that took place in Egypt between over the 2000s, especially say from 2004 to 2010. I mean, it had its ups and downs, but I mean, there was greater freedom in the media space and a little bit more political life and so forth. He views all of that as having been a mistake, just as you said, that you open the door a crack, and before you know it, opposition will come flooding in.
Dave, just one more point on that. I recall the days of Ambassador Richard Doney, who said some of the most remarkable things about how there's freedom of the press in Egypt, there's freedom of religion, that if Mubarak ran for president of the United States, he would win. He said all these things, and you still had to see what kind of incredible attacks there were against him in the government press all throughout Egypt. There's nothing that can be said to mitigate that. This is, a sponsored program in many ways, long-standing. Marvin, I've got a list here, by the way, of the people.
So my question's a little bit to the side, but one of the things that we heard when the Egyptian economy was under enormous pressure after Sisi came into power was that if the Egyptian economy fails, you could see enormous migration to Europe or elsewhere. People, of course, were focused on the situation in Syria, and this was kind of a campaign to the Europeans on the need to support the Egyptian economy. Do we have any evidence about Egyptian attitudes, public attitudes toward the possibility of immigration, or is there any realism to these kinds of threats that if the economy fails, people will leave? Again, if you cite the data that both you and Michelle have put forward of a population growth in the tens of millions in the next few years, with an economy that at best is going to be stagnating, but potentially could be deteriorating much more severely. And it's not even speaking about political stability or anything like that, but what are the prospects of actually seeing major migration from Egypt?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there is some polling data on this, and it's not only Egypt; it's other countries in the region as well that, a lot of the youth want to leave, and they're trying to leave. And the number of I don't know, I saw a figure that, at least 800,000 young Egyptians a year try to get visas to go to either, the United States or other Western countries. And many of them don't get that or whatever. But so there is a real effort. But what you're talking about, and I already mentioned, right, 10 million Egyptians out of 105 million overall are already working out in the diaspora, right? And most of those are in the Gulf, with smaller numbers in the United States and Europe and everywhere. There are two issues. I mean, one issue is how many Egyptians will be able to go out and work outside of Egypt in a legal, controlled way. And there, I think one has to look closely at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, right, with the effort to Saudaize the workforce, and the possibility, that it's not going to be as welcoming a place for Egyptian workers as in the past. Not because of anything against Egypt, but just because of the changes coming about. The fact that relations are not good with Qatar and so forth. So the whole Gulf employment picture, at least, it's not going to be expanding for Egyptians. And so the question is, where are these people going to be absorbed, all these additional laborers? I think that's a question. I think, though, what you're also talking about is uncontrolled migration. That's a different issue, right? I mean, what I'm talking about is sort of people's attempts to go and work. But if we were talking about, thousands of Egyptians getting on boats, or the thing that I think Europe really fears is people elsewhere from the continent of Africa being able to transit Egypt and get into boats and go. I mean, that's a scarier picture, and that's more like what you would be looking at, a situation of state failure or something, if they were actually, unable to stop people from going. I think that's not a near-term prospect. But there's going to be a lot of Egyptians who are not going to be able to be absorbed by the Egyptian economy.
Thomas?
So, I want to say a few things. So, I spent a lot of time in the Arab world, and mostly with men. So, men, they usually ask you the same three questions. And it all depends on the political situation. Can you get me a visa? Why are Western girls so easy, and why does the United States support Israel? So emigration is a very, very important topic for Arab men. They know that their economies just can't give them what they want. Most of them are unskilled, and they don't have the opportunities now that they had before, specifically tourism. I don't have the number off the top of my head, and I didn't put it in the book, percent of population workforce that works in tourism, but they don't have those jobs right now with the political instability, and then the fall in tourists after the attack in Sinai. Michelle talked about Gulf countries and the doors closing. I would equally say Libya. Libya was a big outlet and a valve. I met a lot of Egyptians when I was in Libya, and this instability there has led a lot of them to come home. A lot of these people, they work in the informal economy. It's not the regular economy, and they're just not doing anything real. So those are the reasons that these people want to leave. What are the factors that keep them? A strong sense of nationalism. Egypt is they're very patriotic. They don't want to leave, and fatalism is also very important. So these are the yin and the yang factors on that point.
Tom Lippman, Middle East Institute. I lived in Egypt during the second half of the 1970s, and it's amazing and depressing how many of these very same issues were on the table and have been on the table the whole time ever since, right? Education of women, water supply, migration of labor, you name it. Political liberalization, the Muslim Brotherhood. Anyway, I see things in that context. So when Sadat was negotiating peace with Israel, the most fundamental principle was that every square centimeter of Egyptian territory would have to be returned to Egypt. So given that, I'd like you to talk briefly, if you would, about the politics of giving those islands to Saudi Arabia. Did they just get bought?
That's sure how it looks. Look, I don't have I'm not an expert. I know there's a lot of history here, and I don't know. Maybe the historical case is on the side of Saudi Arabia for the islands. I don't know. Okay, but the thing is that Egyptians certainly believed those islands were theirs. Were brought up to believe, and Egyptian soldiers died protecting those islands. They're very strategic islands. They have defense, utility, and so forth. And so, honestly, in my mind, it's one of the things that President Sisi has done that I find most difficult to explain. There are many decisions of Sisi with which I disagree, but I can at least understand rationally most of them why he did it. But yes, it did happen. I mean, the King of Saudi Arabia, came into town and gave Sisi something, and Sisi gave him those two islands, and it's been very, very controversial, and I can't believe it was popular with the Egyptian military that he did so. And most of the things that he does, for example, his desire not to send ground troops to Yemen, can understand with Egypt's history with Yemen why Egyptians at large and also the military would not have wanted him to do that. But the islands, I have to say, it's a very, very puzzling episode.
So on the islands, yes. First, historical. The Saudis gave up those islands they relinquished control of those islands. They ceded those islands to the Egyptians because of Israeli threats, and they thought the Egyptians could deal with that better. So there is a sovereignty issue there. Secondly, when you talk about Sadat and every inch, you have to understand these things in the context. So that's in an Israeli context. We had the same problem with Syria and the Golan, and Syria and Hatay province, otherwise known as Alexandretta, which the French gave to, which was a part of Syria, and the French gave it to the Turks, I think, in 1939 to support them. It was either 36 and 39. Actually, Rob's written an article about this. In 2004, late 2004, early 2005, Bashar, as part of his rapprochement with the Turks, ceded Syrian claims to Alexandretta. And not only was this very important from a geographical land perspective, but it was also important from a demographic perspective because Alawis populate Alexandretta. There's a large percentage of Alawis. I think I read in the 90s about 500,000. I might be wrong. So that is a problem. And yes, on this issue, I don't think that Sisi and the government realized the backlash that would happen because people are very, very mad about this. And they brought people into the streets. The courts went against him. It's a very important issue for Egyptians, and that's what they feel. They feel that they sold their national sovereignty for 30 talents of silver.
Greg?
Thank you both for your comments. Thank you both for your comments. My question deals with the issue of patronage outside of the military sphere, because previously under the NDP, that was the ticket for patronage to be dispersed. And even independents who ran in parliamentary elections, oftentimes if they won in their district, they wanted to join the NDP to be the head honcho of their sort of district to dispense patronage. So I'm curious, without a regime political party, How is patronage being distributed today in Sisi's Egypt?
So the people, the new elite, and I discussed both these issues in the monograph. Historical patronage and what forms it took. I mean, some candidates had fast food delivered. And I think in one sector in Cairo, I think like 45% of people polled by the Scholar said that they sold their vote. So the patronage issue, you're going to see a shift because there's no there's no ruling party, and I'm not 100% sure. There's been talk about it, but I don't think that it's going to be reconstituted because of the corruption and the problems there. Even Nasser had the same problem with his first attempt at a mass mobilization party. I think he dissolved one in 55, 56. But what we see is these new elites that are supporting Sisi are delving out patronage in these areas to different the people that they need for support. So you're not going to see it reconstituted in a political party perspective, but you will have it at an informal type of relationship, and specifically in rural Egypt, where you can't. It's seen as shameful to buy people's votes, but you can provide them with all kinds of services.
But is that through their own funds or?
Oh yeah, it's all their funds, but everything is given by the government. The manna comes from the government. All these contracts, all these companies that are privatized, and one of the major stipulations of the IMF program is privatizing state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and it's one of the three benchmarks that in the last IMF report the government hasn't met. So if it's pushed, if it's forced to do so very quickly in fire sale prices, it's going to reconstitute what happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where they're going to sell to the friends of the government. And I give several examples of these leading people from the 90s, the businessmen, the Mubarak businessmen. So it's their money, but they got it all from the government, and they have to do that. I mean, I give examples of the Long Live Egypt Fund that Sisi wants, and the people that donated to it.
Yeah, Greg, on the question of patronage, I think it's a really good question, and it gets to the relationship, I think, between Sisi as president and the civilian population. So, obviously, the military and the state are his important constituencies, right? That's where his support resides, and we've already talked about how he needs to push economic benefits their way to make sure that everybody's happy. But what about patronage for civilians? So this is a big difference between the Sisi regime and the Mubarak regime. The Mubarak regime had this National Democratic Party. It had a system for pushing out patronage, throughout the country through local, officials and families and so forth that were all part of the civilian support mechanism for Mubarak. And we also saw in the Mubarak regime a lot more prominent civilians. I mean, Barak, you mentioned that the number of military officers in Sisi's cabinets is not necessarily higher than in Mubarak's cabinets or whatever. But I think there's a pretty big difference. I think, in Mubarak's Egypt, while he was a man from the military, and of course we knew that the defense minister was the second most powerful man in the country, but still there were prominent civilians, right? There were people who rose in the National Democratic Party or other ways and became very important advisors. And Mubarak was getting a lot of advice, whether on the economy, on domestic politics, on international relations, from civilians. Many of them very experienced, either in the world or within Egypt or whatever. That's less the case with Sisi. There are really not too many, civilians, and this has been one reason why we saw Sisi cycle through a lot of cabinets and a lot of prominent people who were in some of the early Sisi cabinets. We don't see them now because, frankly, they weren't listened to and they weren't able to get anything done. So I think there is a problem of, a lack of civilian input to Sisi, or let's say inadequate, maybe not a total lack, but not as much civilian input on important issues like the economy and so forth to Sisi as there could be. And, it gets to this whole issue. As Barak said, there have been, including recently, especially as maybe they move toward amending the constitutions and move toward maybe elections at a local level and so forth, keeps coming up again. Oh, the political parties are going to be consolidated and there's going to be one main party supporting Sisi and so forth. And so far, it hasn't happened. I think that what was going on in the last decade or so of Mubarak, with the National Democratic Party becoming a bit more of a power center and these very wealthy business people, rising within the party and in the circle around Gamal Mubarak and the effort to have him succeed Mubarak, that this was uncomfortable for the military. And this, may have been one reason, or maybe not the only reason, but one reason why, in effect, the military sided with the demonstrators against Mubarak, is they didn't like what they saw happening. And that SCAF very eagerly went along with all the campaigns against the prominent business people of the Mubarak area. Now you've said that's because they objected to their corruption. That may be. I think they also saw them as an emerging power center that needed to be put down. So I think that's, a question now as to how Sisi feels about this, how others high up in the military feel about this. Do they want to see a new civilian, political party emerging that maybe not immediately, but in time could become a new center of power, could become a focus for some of these big business people and so forth. I don't think we have the answer to that yet. But while we don't have the answer, then it becomes more difficult. If you don't have that patronage network and you don't have that political mobilization, doing things like carrying out any kind of credible elections, referenda, and so forth is more difficult. And we've seen that with the elections under Sisi, with the poor turnout and so forth. So we'll see whether they'll mobilize civilians in order to improve that, or whether they'll use coercion. I mean, there was just a report out today that they may indeed enforce the fine for not voting as a way to, sort of coerce people into voting.
We have a bunch more questions here. We've got about 5 minutes. Let's do two questions. Mahmoud and then Zach, and then we'll see if we answer quickly, maybe we'll get another round. If not, I'll make sure to finish on time.
Thanks. My name is Mahmoud Farouk, and I'm from POMED. I would start with a comment on the question that Michelle raised about how do we know what Egyptian thinks. I think there are some. I agree with you. There are no credible polling from Egypt, but however, there are several elements that we can see how Egyptian society thinks of. They would lean towards democratic ideas or human rights, or more towards the regime. In that regard, if you look to one of the things that what Egyptians like in TV series or TV shows, or not TV shows, media, I mean TV series like مسلسلات. In recent times, when you have a TV series that basically about journalists that fight corruption, and you have at the same time you have a TV series that talk about a police officer that basically from the Ministry of Interior that fight the Muslim Brotherhood and fight the NGOs and all the conspiracy theories. All Egyptian watch the TV shows that goes for the police officer, and also the movies. It's a very high rate on that regard. Also, if you look to the 2011 election, which we have the Khaled Ali candidate that comes from the human rights background, he took less than 1%, which can give us an indication. I agree with you that the regime play a main role on silencing everyone that talk about human rights, but also the human rights organizations themselves. They have a deep. I worked in human rights for 10 years or more than that, but there is a main problem in that regard. I will say two quick questions. The first one is in regards to to Barak about the Muslim Brotherhood. You said that the Muslim Brotherhood still exists and the likelihood of being returned is high. Do you think you compare Sisi with Abdel Nasser? When you see that we see Abdel Nasser he basically I would say Sisi killed 800 Muslim Brotherhood in one day. Abdel Nasser killed more. I don't know how many, but it's not compared to what Sisi did in one day. You have this, and also you have the Muslim Brotherhood that have been.
Or what's the question?
The question is how likely you see the Muslim Brotherhood coming back as an organization, not as ideas. I agree that their ideas still exist, but the organization does not exist as it was.
All right, let's give the second question to Zach, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, David. Thank you all. Very interesting talk. You both mentioned the importance of FDI in Egypt, and so I thought I would give you the opportunity to address Chinese investment, as well as I know David brought up Russian investment, but given that both those countries are of great interest in this city, what Chinese and Russian investment in Egypt does and will mean for great power competition. Thank you.
Okay, so Brotherhood and FDI. Quick.
So I think I spoke during my opening remarks about the Brotherhood. Yes, they will return as an organization. They are going to reestablish themselves on college campuses because that's where the movement draws its supporters, and by offering welfare services. As to FDI, I don't have the numbers of the top 10 off the top of my head, but I know that the top ones are Western European countries, and I think 9 or 10 come Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. I don't remember seeing China in the middle. China is not a big investor in Egypt. It is, however, I think the biggest. I wrote a shorter piece of that. China is the biggest investor in Ethiopia. So China is expanding all over Africa. They give loans, and I think there's been articles also in the press about this in the Times and the Post. Give loans, favorable loans. I think in Montenegro, they give favorable loans and they push infrastructure projects. They're not doing that in Egypt.
Michelle?
Yeah, on that question, so yes, I mean, the Chinese, are investing in a big way in the new administrative capital, and the thing to watch for, I think, are the loans. I mean, that's one thing we didn't talk about is Egypt's external debt, which is very large and has grown massively in recent years. I mean, that's why that internal picture of reserves and everything, it's a little misleading because external debt, that's another thing that Sisi has done that I would guess makes the military a little unhappy. Normally, they don't like to see a really high external debt because it can become a sovereignty issue. Anyway, so we'll see. I think, the Chinese will probably see how their experience goes with building the new administrative capital, and perhaps they'll move on from there. The Russians, the interesting thing there has been, of course, there's the talk of the nuclear power plant, and then there's been talk of development of the Suez Canal zone and Russian investment there. So, we'll have to see where that goes. But those are things that I would guess that Russian and Chinese investment in Egypt will grow over time. Just on the human rights issue, Mahmoud, I think that sometimes we judge countries like Egypt somehow differently from other countries. I mean, if we would look at, say, for example, like how many Americans are members of Amnesty International or support Human Rights Watch, tiny. It's a little tiny niche elite issue. It's not, you know what I'm saying? But I think the question is more, do people accept things like police brutality as a normal part of life or not? And what we saw in 2011 was that all of a sudden a number of these issues like economic injustice and police brutality and everything that were part of people's everyday lives. And everyone said, oh, the Egyptians are so tolerant, they accept it. And then all of a sudden people didn't accept it. And everybody started talking about it and complaining and shouting about it and so forth. So, I don't know. I don't think, and I always think these kind of polls where people are asked, well, what do you care about more? Having food on the table or human rights? I mean, they're very misleading. Or having food on the table or democracy. I mean, of course, one is a concrete and one to people is a bit of an abstract. But it can become. But if you ask people, is it okay with you that if you go to the police station to make a complaint, you might get beaten up or thrown into jail? People would probably say, well, actually, no, that's not okay with me. Anyway, I think, sometimes it's very, very, these things are weighed in a way that to me isn't realistic. Yeah.
Thanks. I know that we have a couple more questions here, but I'm going to wrap up. I'd like to thank you, Barack, and Michelle, for a really great panel. It's such a rare treat in Washington to get the opportunity to talk about Egypt for 2 hours. And I know our audience really appreciated it. So thank you very much.